What recommendations would you have?
Before the talking comes the listening and the asking of good questions to better understand where is the other side in this communication. You need it in a condensed format. You are not going to sit down and attend a 2-hour webinar as a decision maker or advisor to the patient. You can contextualize all of the important aspects and then address misperceptions.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Portegies.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas that shape the future of medical affairs. Today, we're joined by Daniela van Eickels. She is the Senior Vice President and Head of Medical Affairs at Kyowa Kirin. As a physician by training, Daniela has led medical affairs across global, regional, and local teams, building high-performance organizations and mentoring talent in creating patient-centered solutions. In this episode, we explore how she's rethinking traditional medical communications approaches. Welcome to the show, Daniela.
Welcome, Wesley. Thank you so much. And I'm super glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So maybe to open here, I know that you have been a practicing physician, and that's definitely going to be an important topic to talk about today. Can you share a moment with me, or the moment, better to say, when you really realized that you wanted to help translating science into practical solutions for physicians like yourself, and of course, ultimately for patients, that, it would kind of form your mission beyond individual patient care?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. And you said I'm a physician, and I'm actually coming from an internal medicine background. So that's an area where the talking to the patient and being in that interaction and finding out more about their symptoms and how they're dealing with them and all of that is definitely very prominent. And so I think my journey actually wasn't kind of a moment, but it was more like a gradual development, because when I worked in the clinic, I took care of patients with many of the typical internal medicine diseases like diabetes, hyperlipidemia, arterial hypertension. And this was at a time where there was a lot of innovation, particularly on secondary prevention. And you could see like very big studies, amazing science, mechanism of actions, and just all around remarkable efforts in drug development. But you looked at that added value of innovation and you saw how much that was counterbalanced by lack of adherence, lack of understanding of the right dosing, lifestyle changes, and all of that. So it became very obvious to me that it's a really huge lift to translate from like the clinical data to something that can then pull through and have that clinical meaningful outcome. So I understood that this is really important, that physicians can communicate in the right way and they can connect the dots when they think about the individual patient and all the knowledge and the science they have in the back of their mind, and kind of just reinforce that having great data doesn't mean that those data will speak to themselves. You really need to make sure that you can explain it and that you also, for yourself as a decision maker or advisor to the patient, you can contextualize all of the important aspects and then address misperceptions and kind of take a decision on what you would recommend from a treatment perspective and motivate the patient to come with you. So the importance of communication and being able to dissect information and share has always been there. Kind of focusing more on it in the second part of my career has definitely been kind of a leveling up on that aspect, but it was there all along.
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful answer. And I like how you were talking about contextualizing data and the need as a physician to be able to do so. Something that I'm always thinking about is how can the industry potentially help better with that? Because we ultimately look at our data and that is what it all is about. And that is understandable. But data is data. And then, of course, as you said, like as a physician, you're working with humans and you need to kind of make this translation. Is there anything you think pharma could do better to help humanizing and contextualizing data when they communicate this to the physician in the first place?
Yeah, well, we can always do better, right? With everything we do. And I would say in this instance, what comes to my mind primarily is you need to really understand your audience very well, and you need to be able to kind of continuously check in on how they are moving along and their learning and information understanding journey, if you want. We see that in launches and how the landscape change and how people are adapting and how they are in the interaction with the patients, learning new aspects that they should be considering. And so I do think before the talking comes the listening and the asking of good questions to better understand where is the other side in this communication and in their understanding. And once you have done that, you can much more adapt the communication and you can be taking perhaps a different perspective because you want not only that information is shared out, but that it is received in the right way and that it's presented and it's understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of research on that actually. And one of my favorite parts is there was this McKinsey white paper. I think it's some time ago. I think it was The Future of Medical Affairs 2025 or something like that. And they quoted basically that a lot of physicians feel like, okay, this is data. Now what? And I really feel that we need to find more and more ways how we can put that into context already for them and help them a little bit with that translation as well. So I'm really intrigued, of course, by your experience as a physician communicating with patients. Could you help me understand like how it was for you at the time? You would be talking with patients. How would like communications from pharma companies fuel your conversations? Like, can you maybe shine some light on like what was useful for you or most useful for you, and what could you really apply from what you received from pharma?
Yeah. So I do think, there is that piece of information that's served to you that is the entry point into makes you curious to know more. And I think what has been really important to me to go into a dialogue because there is perhaps elements that are easier to understand for you or you have been looking for them anyhow. And then there's things that are perhaps not on top of mind but they're really, really very relevant for you in the context with that individual situation with a patient, for instance. Or I think often underestimated is for you to understand how feasible is that. So the context of the healthcare environment and what would that mean in a hospital in an ambulatory setting and with a hospitalized patient, how could that even be done? What does that mean from a monitoring perspective and all of that? Which is more like logistical aspects around it. And I do think that's, for instance, something when you think about how we traditionally share out, let's say, pivotal data readouts, they were produced with a regulatory body's logic behind, and then you're very good because they give you a good understanding of the efficacy and safety profile of the drug. But data that are not relevant in the context of the approval, they tend not to be the focus even on primary publications. But if you have done your homework and you understand this whole context a little bit more, you might really want to stick in additional information from the very beginning because you know that it's relevant. This sounds theoretical, but I can give you one example. Like I was part of efforts to launch the first CAR T-cell therapies. And for sure, there was the science and how is the product manufactured? How does that all work? And then for sure, what comes out, efficacy, safety, a lot of debate around what are modality-specific side effects and how you manage them. All very important. But I think for many physicians that were early adapters, it was important to know how were these patients treated? How many days were they on the ICU? Was it like more like a safety measure or did they need to be there because they needed to plan for capacity and things like that? So I would say not the usual information that you want to put into publications and into your communication, but so informative and so important for a safe and efficacious delivery of that treatment to patients. So I think just really getting into somebody else's shoes and looking into what they need is so crucial to information delivered by the pharma companies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think seeing it through the lens of the audience and how their lives look like on a daily basis, I think is so important. I would almost claim it would be very hard to effectively communicate if you don't do that. And that's also why I think it's always really commendable when I see senior leaders in medical affairs go on like co-visits with MSLs and these kind of things too, because they really want to learn and see the practice. And I think that's beautiful, and that's what we need more of. And I guess talking about MSLs, that's in my mind one other very important channel, of course. And the advantage of having an MSL in the room is that you actually have someone who can do that interpretation and contextualization that you mentioned as well, right? What is your view on that in terms of the function of field medical, the impact they have on the HCP community?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a fantastic role. I mean, one's for those that do it because they have such a broad scope, and what they impact is also so essential. So, I would say the introduction of the role of the MSL has definitely been a huge step at the time. And let's not forget, field team, like way back, was initially more like on the sales side. Then there was the recognition that you needed information sharing more broadly, and perhaps without that kind of promotional aspect behind it and the scientific exchange, like we call it. So this was all kind of something that I applaud to and that I do definitely think is great. But then what has happened is that we saw more and more kind of diverse aspects in what a physician could ask for. And so we added other roles, and we have somebody who can speak more to the value of the product and so on and so forth. But the time that a physician has on its daily life hasn't kind of increased. And so it's a little bit, I would say, as per definition, very, very helpful to have these conversations and have the MSL. But is the time with individual physicians potentially not as substantial as we might wish. And then on the other hand, also, like, if you go into one-on-one interactions, there's only a limited people you can touch and you can have that conversation with. So I would just say you really need to think more broadly, and you need to kind of perhaps see the MSL as where you can deep dive, where you can have a real dialogue in lifetime, like an exchange in real time. That's the big strength, but it is definitely not what I would see as the only avenue to share information. And I think the MSL is also bound when they see physicians that's during their working hours. Many might kind of shift this when they want to get new information towards the out of office hours. And so I think there is a lot of complexity in this whole environment that requires you to think of the MSL as one, and for sure, a very important part of the delivery of medical information and scientific exchange, but definitely not the only one. So kind of that automatism that you often have in organizations, like, oh, we have information that equals an MSL going into a one-on-one conversation with a physician. It's just bringing it down too narrow of an approach. So that's, I think, my full enthusiasm for the MSL role and what they can do, but also very cognizant of the limitations that we have with these one-on-one interactions.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. And I actually am hearing that a lot from our clients as well. So I also want to underline field medical is an amazing function. It's very important. MSLs are amazing human beings. But how many people can you really reach? And it's all based on the premise that you engage a small group of people, but those are the people that kind of lead the field. And those people typically then perhaps present at a conference. But then the question is the rest of the community able to go to that conference, or are those other KOLs or key external experts, as we sometimes call them? And I think that's kind of what you're saying as well, right? So you reach a small group of people really, really well. But then there is a large group of people that also need a lot of information and might be not really in the scope of what can be done. So could you just maybe tell me about a time where you expanded a little bit beyond this traditional field channel and drove HCP engagement beyond that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's the more classical approaches that's within the same function to do like your publication. And I think there's really good ways of doing it. And it starts with choosing which outlet, which journal, because that makes you think about whom do you want to reach. I mean, if I really want to reach a GP, I don't know if a Lancet publication is going to be helpful. And so that tells you a lot, and kind of having strategic planning of different elements that need to be learned first to be in initial publications and then go to later on. But on the other hand, I'm thinking these high value peer reviewed publications, while they're really giving us credibility and they're super important, they might not be 100% reflecting on today's learning behaviors and learning needs. I think, I mean, when have you been the last time in the library kind of looking up like a book or something to find out about a certain aspect? We do go, I would say nowadays we go on the internet, and we do perhaps even not like read the fine print on a very glossy screen. We perhaps rather watch like a summary video or somebody talking us through, or somebody having kind of a fireside chat about certain things. Or we want to make sure we have something like artificial intelligence who puts together like certain bits and pieces of information, things like that. I think they're becoming more and more important. The other thing that I think is super helpful and to me very powerful is peer-to-peer education. And while you would, you can argue that the key experts that you just quoted, they know very well about the data and the information. They sit in very privileged spaces, I would say, because they are having the ability to really dive deep into something and to focus on a certain area. But they also get pre-selected patients sent to them. They get a little bit of a different outset, I would say, compared to somebody who is more a generalist, more serving a broader population and everything. So if you want that, this really like very versed expert to share their experience, and they start trying to do this in a way how they would exchange with another expert, they might lose their audience in a way. And what I found really, really powerful is to kind of reflect and think through typical educational gaps and where things are not well understood when thinking about these peer-to-peer interactions, and provide some feedback. And we often see that because we see adaptation and we have colleagues that do market research. So we get some of these signals, and I feel this can be really, really cool collaboration with these experts to kind of reflect on what happens outside of their very expert practice and everything, and reflect on that, because then they can speak more really to where these people are that they're trying to bring on board. And it's not pointing fingers or something. I think it's more like realizing that oftentimes the problem is much simpler than just the latest bit of data that isn't understood, and you need to build it more from the basis.
Is MedComms evolving faster than your team can keep up? You're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Wesley Portegies, host of Transforming Medical Communications, is offering a limited number of free 30-minute consultancy sessions for medical affairs professionals. Whether it's medical communications, field medical, or medical affairs training, these sessions provide an opportunity to address your real-world challenges, pressure test ideas, and walk away with practical strategic insight for your team. No fluff, just strategy. Follow the on-screen link or in the show notes to book your free session now.
I think this is kind of a full circle moment, Daniela, because we're back to you need to know your audience. And that isn't just true for us as an industry or as MedComms agencies, but that is also true for KOLs or KEs educating their peers. And I never thought about it this way, actually. So I really like how you explained that, because the problems that community physicians are facing might be completely different and on a completely different level than what the academics, so to say, would maybe expect. And it made me think about the project we worked on once. It was in the medical information space where, we were trying to figure out like how to communicate all these trial results properly and so on. And someone from the client team came in and said like, well, listen, this is the most asked question. Can we break this tablet in two? And I think that's a good example of like, yeah, sometimes you just really need to step into the world of the people that are using your product, that are there in the field, like working with it and understand really what is blocking them. And sometimes that's indeed way more simple than we think. So I really like that observation. Yeah, so that being said, not all HCPs have the same level of expertise. That's, I think, what we take away from the last part we were talking about here. That also means we need to adapt our content for specialists versus generalists or academics for that matter. And how do you go about that? Do you have any insights in how we can achieve that?
Yeah, so two things come to mind. And I think the one is really like if you do like a patient journey and you think normally what happens with like generalist to specialist is perhaps that a generalist sees a patient first. Like they don't really understand if it's a first, like an undiagnosed patients that need to get diagnosed first. They come with symptoms. But patients at that level, they often don't describe their symptoms as we would do that in a medical textbook. They don't say, I have weakness in my arms or I have muscular weakness in my arms. They say, I am having problem carrying the groceries home. And you think like, okay, so why is that? It can be everything at that moment. It can be problem in your hands, can be problem walking there. And if you have kind of an unconscious bias because you see these kind of patients all the time with that disease, but not that, and that's what the generalist does, right? They see diseases that are very frequent. They see them most of the time, and then others they don't. You might be in your mind just going and assuming something, and you don't even ask the question. And so I think we have perhaps, if we really talk to generalists and we are asking them to help with diagnosing patients, I think we need to be open to explore, how does that really translate into not patient symptoms, but rather patient worries or patient complaints? Because again, nobody will give it the medically correct term. They rather come with what it means for them. And the same, by the way, with treatment monitoring. If you ask somebody, okay, how are you doing with your pain? That's pretty much a question if you have accepted the pain, if it has always been there, and then you will, level set there and you will say, oh, I'm fine, just doing fine. If you will do that a little bit more and say like, oh, when have you been on a walk the last time? Or are you looking forward to seeing your grandchildren? And can you go on a playground with them or something that's more reflective of what that means for them? Then you get a much better picture. And I think helping to translate the symptoms that we are looking for into what that means and kind of at least as a teaser into understanding and seeing a certain patient type. That for me is pretty much communication more to a generalist who is trying to figure out which direction could that go because they have such a broad array of diseases that they could be looking for. And it's totally different than a specialist that gets somebody referred that already comes with a stack of clinical results, of tests, of whatever. And they can look at that and then it comes most of the time with a little note from the generalist that saw that patient. It says patient has weakness of the arms and that all started 3 weeks post in fact. And I don't know. I guess you are getting where I'm going with that. Your information will be looking very much different because you can pick up on how they're seeing this conversation to unfold and what information they will be getting from the patient. And so I also think if you are a GP and you see so many different diseases and you want to get up to date with something new, you need it in a condensed format. You are not going to sit down and attend a 2-hour webinar. I mean, you might, but just generally speaking, a 2-hour webinar on something that you perhaps come across like once a year. You might wish to because you really are interested in finding out more, or you might even do it because you just had somebody. But just to also inform you about that, I don't even think you have the time, even if you wish to. And so you need to get the key information, the red flags, what to do if I think it could be this in a much more condensed way. Somebody who is seeing predominantly a pre-selected patient population, and then it's trying to find out nuances, and that's where they will learn in your 2-hour webinar. I think that's worth their effort and worth their time, and they're super happy to do this and perhaps stay on a chat for half an hour longer afterwards to just clarify a couple of specific aspects. And I think really it depends on where we see the biggest hurdle for access to patients to that therapy, where we need to invest to provide the tailored information.
Absolutely. And I like how you put this together so logically. Now, this indeed is very logical in my mind, but in reality, what I'm seeing, at least from my lens, is still a lot of kind of one size fits all, or what I prefer to say, one size fits no one approach when it comes to communication. So I think everyone understands this, right? Like I have never met anyone who said like, no, I think everyone should get exactly the same information, right? We all understand that. But now...
But then we do.
Yeah, what do we then do, right? And what we do is ultimately often send the same information to everyone. So more practically, when we think about channels, formats, like omnichannel is still kind of more a buzzword and I guess more used on the commercial side than medical at this point, but when it comes to real omnichannel. So what recommendations would you have? Like if it's up to you, how would we effectively and practically communicate different messages to different audiences?
Yeah. So number one, I do think you need to figure out if the messages are really the same for the different audiences, because they're requesting a different, or they have a different viewpoint on it, right? But if it was to be really the key point you need to bring across, and it's to different audiences, I think it's the breadth and the depth of the information that you will need to vary. And I would say you can think about it very simply of, we do, for instance, have a primary data package, which is published in a peer-reviewed, super high-placed journal. And then we have a slide deck that goes with it that the MSL can use. That's already kind of a little bit of a trimming it down so that you understand the key information, because it's going to have less space for what's really important. But then you might want to think like perhaps have, for the same kind of specialty, but a little bit not as academically approaching it, kind of a summary that's just a one-pager that has key information on it, or perhaps 2 pages that you could discuss or hand out upon request or whatever. And then you might have, if you go to a very broad audience, and perhaps you might just have the key things of what to do with this. I just think you can work from one set of information and just break it down to different level of complexity. And I would say if you overwhelm people, and I feel this often happens when people are particularly proud of knowing all the details and having figured it out, that they want to share that and offer that to everybody. And that's a great thing to do. But for some people, that might just be too much. And if I see in my entry paragraph something that already looks so complicated, and then I'm like, perhaps, oh, you know what? I think just give me what I need to do, and the rest I trust that you're good. And I think you need to acknowledge for that in a certain way. And I think that might be once in a while a little bit harder for medical, because they are asked, per se, to know so much and be so well-rounded, and then to hold back and be more selective on how to share what and make it digestible and everything, I think is perhaps once in a while feeling a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, that is probably why a lot of medical communications assets look like they are. And what I mean by that is they typically look overcrowded. And I think that's because we want to communicate everything to everyone. And again, it comes down to understanding what your audience really needs. And I really like the perspective that you gave, because in a way you were saying, in the industry, we're all experts of our data. But you can be an expert. That doesn't mean you need to make everyone else an expert too. They just need to know what they need to know. So what part of your expertise can you convey to them in a way that they understand and that helps them in their profession, right? That's kind of ultimately what it comes down to.
You said that very nicely. And I think we're doing a better and better job at the moment in doing these lay summaries, for instance. And then, I think we also need to accept that for certain audience within the healthcare professional community that they don't want it all or not readily made. I mean, they can still be referred to the background document or whatever. I'm not saying don't give it to them no matter what, but it should be more like you'll be able to decide how much you want to dive deep into it or how much you just want to first understand and perhaps later come back to it, or you might never need to because it's just, you wanted to understand if that's of relevance to you and decided it's not.
Absolutely. I'm quite inspired by this part of our discussion, actually. And it makes me think about how the medical communications world looked like maybe 10 years ago. So I started MedComms Experts like 12, 13 years ago now. And when I think back, I think we would typically not even really wonder about the different audiences, right? There was some like segmentation and understanding like who are we communicating to, of course. But it took some time before it became almost like the standard to make sure like, okay, we have this project. Here's like the 4 audiences we're going to communicate to. This is how they're different. This is what they need to know. This is how they are looking at this data potentially and how we can make sure it's as useful as possible for them. And I think where we currently are as an industry, in my personal view, I'm curious how you think about it, is we now have that information. So we understand the different communication segments or whichever we want to call it. We understand how we can adapt our communications to it as well. And I think where we are now is figuring out how do we get these different communications efficiently to these audiences through different channels. And that is part of the omni-channel equation, right? Which I think is often still looked at least on the medical side, as multi-channel, which communicates the same information through multiple channels versus almost like a personalized approach, which is like the epitome of omni-channel would be that everyone gets exactly the information they need. Nothing less, nothing more. And it's at the right time, exactly when they need it. And I think that's the part we're really figuring out, like how do we get it to them?
Yes. And I think most likely this has been a little bit harder in medical because of the framework we give ourselves, that we always need to make sure that's for everybody in the pharma industry. If you want to be balanced, then where does this end? And then the information needs to grow to contain all of the relevant bits and pieces of information. But then also like overthinking like, but if we miss that, or if people can get too selective, it might be misleading. And so I think that has made it a little bit more complex, that to a certain extent you have a responsibility of how picky somebody can be and how much they need to see in order to get a rounded understanding of the information, right? And so that's, I think, definitely something when you allow people to choose and pick where you have a certain limit as to how selective you can have somebody be. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's how it works in academia, right? Like people are trained to communicate the full picture so that you're not biased and cherry picking. That makes total sense. Now, how well does that work in a communication strategy is a little bit of a question. And that's indeed where I think the friction is between effective communication strategy and the mission of medical affairs. And figuring that equation out, I think, is extremely important. And to give an example from my end, like we're very active in like the publication extender field, and we often have these discussions about what is a publication extender. And more specifically, is an extender a summary? So there's basically 2 camps. So there's people who say a publication extender should just summarize what is in the publication. And then there's people that say, well, that depends on who is receiving it. So for instance, in your example with the general practitioners or primary care providers, the same publication would have a different meaning than for an academic. So how would you communicate that while staying within the confines and boundaries of proper science and making sure you show the full picture and you're not biased?
Yeah, totally agree. But I also think when we think of these aspects, perhaps we are also kind of once in a while overthinking it a little bit. And we do a lot of insight seeking or advice seeking more from a content perspective. But I think if we are fair, I think we need to have more interaction even on that topic, because I think we play a very crucial role in pharma in providing information. And it's something that I think we do perhaps a little bit in a silo in defining how would we do this and what's helpful, and working more with people in the field that have dedicated time and efforts to the education part is very, very important, because they have their own thoughts on how to train and onboard their peers on new information and data. And I think to understand where they see the trends going and where they think kind of what role or what kind of collaboration could be set up would definitely be something that I would love to do more, because I think it is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed this discussion so much. I had a lot of fun talking about all these things with you. I have one last question for you, which is, what is a topic that you would like to see in a future episode of Transforming Medical Communications?
Yeah, I think really content on demand that is medical, or something where you can go on demand into an exchange and into a scientific exchange, and kind of like chat forums or something with peers or things like that. Just because I think we all enjoy conferences so much. And the big thing about conferences is, from my perspective, is not so much the presentation from the podium. It's people being all together and being able to debate and discuss and dissect. And I think that's always where the real magic happens. And if we could extend that learning experience and more into the virtual room and more on an on-demand, because not everybody has time when it's offered, and kind of do this in an asynchronous way, I think that would be something I would love to learn more about, on whether it's best practice examples and how that can be best done.
Amazing. That's a great topic. Can't make any promises, but I will definitely try. Daniela, thank you so much for the conversation today. Thank you for being here, sharing all your insights. It was really amazing to learn about your perspectives, both as a physician and as someone in the industry as well. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of your efforts in helping us getting that right. It's so important because, again, the data doesn't speak to itself, and communicating it properly is key.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedComms experts. To find out more about MedComms experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit www.medcoms-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedComms Experts, thanks for listening.